3 short stories about cheating on your husband. Mrs. Batman. I stepped out of the hotel room shower, once again amazed at the luxury of the presidential suite. I'm not one to indulge my desires, but my recent good fortune in the form of a huge annual bonus had made up for the long hours I'd been working, which meant a weekend in the most expensive hotel room in town was necessary to revitalize my marriage. I headed for the bathroom door, wrapping a towel around my waist, when there was a knock on the hotel room door. I opened the bathroom door ajar, knowing that my wife loved to tease the room service staff. I wasn't disappointed, as I watched Savannah loosen the waistband of her hotel robe, until almost her entire lush body was exposed before opening the door. To our mutual surprise, however, it was a pretty little blonde who pushed the cart with our dinner into the room. "Come in," my wife muttered, stepping aside and lightly tucking her robe in. The young lady was taking the lids off the plates when she turned to my wife. "Hello," she exclaimed excitedly. "Welcome back, Mrs. Wayne." Like Batman, she finished with a smile, clearly proud to have greeted a VIP guest by name. My wife's eyes widened slightly at being recognized, as she quickly glanced toward the bathroom where I remained out of her sight. Remembering that my wife's boss always introduced himself when introducing himself, Bruce Wayne, like Batman. Probably 1,000 times in the last few years, suddenly gave me a hole in my stomach. I finished toweling myself dry and dressed in my hotel robe as my wife disposed of our little waitress. I hoped she had rewarded her with a big enough tip for her invaluable service. "Hi, honey," I shouted as I came out of the bathroom. "Can you go get some ice? I have a bottle of champagne we need to chill." The lustful grin I bestowed on her as our eyes met let her know where I intended to pour the champagne as soon as it cooled. I held out the ice bucket to her. Savannah smiled and stretched like a cat. Her body as gorgeous as the day we got married. As she stood up and headed barefoot toward the door, I yelled out, "Take off your robe." She was a latent exhibitionist, and assuming Savannah would accept the challenge, I wasn't surprised when she threw off her robe, showed me her tongue, and quickly rushed through the room door. The banging, pleading, and crying started about a minute later, and seemed to continue for a while as I quietly gathered all my clothes. And it was almost 10 minutes before I heard the door open, before the visitor was stopped by the security chain. "I'm not ready for room service yet, thank you." I started to close the door when someone struggled to open it. "It's the hotel manager," came a desperate voice through the remaining gap. "What can I do for you?" I asked kindly through the ajar door. "Could you let your wife go back to your room, sir?" he asked. Apparently he didn't like to scandalize the people who had booked the presidential suite. "My wife? I can assure you there is no one I would like to share my life with here in this hotel," was my honest answer. A loud cry of pain seemed to come from the hallway at my comment as the manager turned to speak to Savannah. She seemed to have managed to get a towel somewhere, and dried tears adorned her pretty face. "Are you saying that's not your wife?" The manager tried again. "We have an employee who says she saw this woman in your room just 15 minutes ago." I saw a pretty little blonde waitress standing nervously behind the manager, trying desperately not to be dragged into this mess. I addressed the waitress directly. "If you recognize this woman, what's her name?" While the waitress answered in a timid voice, "Mrs. Wayne." A loud "not E.T." came out of Savannah's mouth. I looked at my sobbing, soon-to-be ex-wife. "I'm definitely not Wayne, my last name is Lyons. Maybe this woman is an easygoing girl who got lost. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a busy day ahead of me." And with those words I closed the door on my wife and marriage. Return to sender. As I placed the last bag of my wife's clothes on top of the large pile that occupied my mother-in-law's living room, I thought once again that traveling with newborns is not easy. My father-in-law, Michael, turned to me with a smile. "It was unlucky that you had to travel for work so soon after little Gregory was born. But Marie and I are glad they are here." I smiled back at him briefly as my wife cautiously entered the room. It had only been 3 days since the C-section. Lexi looked tired, but beautiful. The pale smile she turned toward me let me know how much that small movement had taken its toll on her. She gratefully allowed her mother to help her into the padded chair I'd carried only moments ago. And her satisfied sigh let me know that she planned to spend a lot of time there during my absence. I looked around at the scene in front of me, my wife and newborn surrounded by loving relatives. "Michael," I said somewhat loudly, raising 3 pairs of curious eyes to meet mine. "Do you remember what you said at our wedding when the priest asked, 'Who is giving this woman in marriage?'" Michael's eyes flashed for a moment at this pleasant memory, as he answered with a smile on his good-natured face. "Of course I remember, Jared. It was one of the proudest moments of my life," I said. Her mother and I, Marie and Lexi, looked at Michael with identical smiles as they joined him in that happy memory. I let the moment linger a little longer before saying it outright. "Well, I'd like her back." All 3 smiles wavered for a moment before Michael and Marie burst into laughter. The complete lack of emotion in my speech, and my continued silence, slowly stopped their mirth. "What are you talking about, Jared?" Michael asked, more curiosity than concern on his face. Instead of answering, I simply pulled my iPhone out of my pocket and pressed the play button. Michael's eyes widened as he heard his own voice coming from the small speaker. "Mrs. Frizzle said she saw you having dinner with Aaron Stender last night." Lexi's voice came through clearly. "It was just dinner, Daddy. Married less than a month and you're dating a guy who almost ruined your life. You're out of your mind." "It was just a dinner," Lexi interrupted firmly. "Aaron just wanted a chance to say goodbye properly. And with all the wedding madness, we couldn't get together sooner." "You better be careful," Michael's voice warned. "If Jared finds out," Lexi cut him off. "Jared won't find out. And I'm not going to ever see Aaron again, so you can relax." I put my phone back in my pocket as the recording came to an end. "You're not going to abandon my daughter because of one date that happened almost 10 months ago?" Michael asked incredulously. His wife and daughter seemed equally shocked as they sat behind him. "No," I answered quietly. "Only a crazy man would leave his wife for one date with an ex-lover." I made sure to emphasize the ex as I slowly shifted my gaze to the small crib with the newborn baby. 2 pairs of eyes slowly followed mine, widening with growing horror as the realization of what I was saying finally came. As for my soon-to-be ex-wife, she covered her face with her hands, silent sobs shaking her entire body as the real reason for the sudden move-in with her parents came to her attention. I took another look around at the scene, finally letting the sadness I had been holding back overwhelm me. All my hopes and dreams were over before they even began. I turned toward the door. The rest of her belongings would arrive with the movers later today. Please understand that as far as I am concerned, our relationship and marriage is null and void. I have no desire to ever speak to your cheating daughter again, and I would appreciate it if you could convince her to simply sign the divorce papers when they arrive. And with those words I was out the door to start all over again. Nature versus nurture. I probably wouldn't have been so annoyed by the sound of the doorbell if I hadn't just turned on a soccer game and sat down with a beer. With my wife and 3 daughters off shopping for prom dresses, I had the rare opportunity to spend a Saturday watching a sports broadcast without interruption from household chores. Such an occasion deserved, at least in my opinion, my full attention. I headed for the door, secretly praying for the instant and agonizing death of all Mormons and sellers of something. Preparing to get rid of my unwanted guest in a hurry, I swung the door open, only to have my bad mood get much worse. "I don't think you've become a Mormon, have you?" were the first words to come off my lips as I looked closely at my ex-wife for the first time in over 18 years. To say that Vivian was a little embarrassed by my first salvo would be an understatement, as she just stood there with her mouth open. I noticed the late series Mercedes in her driveway, and the small boulder she still wore as her wedding ring, and figured she was still married to Dr. Jerry Spalding. Vivian seemed to have recovered a little from her stunned state when she finally replied, "No, Thomas, I'm not a Mormon," she declared, looking uncomfortable as we both looked at each other. "Why on earth would you ask that?" "Well," I replied seriously, "it's probably the only thing that could make things worse." "Why are you here, Vivian?" Vivian suddenly seemed unsure of herself, and I took the opportunity to compare this latest version to the Vivian I had known all these years. At 44, Vivian was still a beautiful woman. Her long blonde hair was now a stylish shoulder length, and her figure was now a fuller version of the supple young woman I had fallen in love with my freshman year of college. The wrinkles that had always been in the corners of her mouth now seemed to point slightly downward, and the green eyes that had originally captivated me seemed a little sadder, but otherwise she was just an older version of my first love. I was wondering if I could talk to you about Benjamin, Vivian ventured, her eyes meeting mine in a sort of silent plea. I noticed her twiddling her thumbs, and for the first time I realized how nervous she was about coming to me. Why on earth would I want to talk to you about Benjamin after all these years? I asked incredulously. Well, he's still your son, Vivian said hastily, as if trying to convince me of that statement. Her eyes snapped away from mine as she saw a momentary flash of fury. My son, I roared. You have the nerve to come here after what you did to me and say that. I actually sputtered, droplets of saliva flying out of my mouth as the anger consumed me. I knew this was a bad idea, Vivian muttered, turning away from me. I just had to try. Surprisingly, I heard my wife's voice in my head. Allison, who had pulled me out of the broken bitter wreck that I was and helped me rebuild my life so that I could be proud of myself, seemed to stand beside me and comfort me. Talk to her, end it. Before Vivian could come down from the porch, I called out to her. Viv, wait, we need to talk. She turned to me as I waved her toward the open door. Let's go inside and sit down. Vivian cautiously approached me and stepped through the door, taking in the atmosphere of a middle-class family home built around 3 precocious young women. I led her into the kitchen and started brewing coffee as she sat down at the kitchen table. Still cream, no sugar? I asked, busily preparing our coffee. In response to her affirmative nod, I finished and handed her the mug. Taking a seat across from her, I set the ball rolling. So tell me what's going on. Well, Vivian began cautiously. As you probably know, Ben has always been a bitch to punish. But in the last few years he's gotten a lot worse. I interrupted her before she continued. How do I know Ben's in trouble? I've had no interest in you or Ben since you left when he was less than a year old until today. Vivian seemed a little surprised by my statement, though I had no idea why. Between her and her rich doctor boyfriend, my access to Benjamin was a battle I couldn't and wouldn't win. I just thought you'd try to keep up with what was going on in his life. Vivian slowed her step and stopped, seeing by the look on my face that this lunge of hers was going nowhere. I just want to say how sorry I am for the way I handled our breakup. She tried again, staring at her still nervously intertwined fingers. I never had any intention of hurting you. She looked up to see how I was handling that clear line of garbage. Whatever she saw on my face seemed to convince her to start over. Anyway, for the past few years Ben had been in trouble for a variety of reasons, including stealing, fighting, and most recently drugs. She sighed as if preparing for what she was about to tell me. 2 weeks ago he got into a fight and beat up another guy really bad. There were drugs and guns, and well, now that he's turning 18 they want to charge him as an adult. There were tears in her eyes as she looked at me again. Jerry abandoned him and didn't even hire a lawyer to defend him. He says Ben deserves to be in jail for everything. Maybe you. Vivian stopped and I offered her a tissue to wipe her eyes. I know I have no right to ask you after everything that's happened, but I can't bear the thought of him in that horrible prison. He really is a sweet boy. He's just. I let Vivian slow down and stop. Her breathing was ragged as she tried to control her emotions. Vivian looked at me, waiting for my response as I took a sip of my coffee. I stared out the window for a moment, contemplating what to say to her. Vivian, do you remember the movie Let's Switch Places? I asked, looking out at the soothing panorama of my backyard. Vivian was confused again when she answered. You mean the one with Eddie Murphy? You made me watch it as part of our Christmas movie marathon? What does that have to do with? I raised my hand to stop her. Besides being one of the greatest movies ever made, there was a strong philosophical question at the heart of the movie. I continued, knowing that Vivian was more than a little puzzled by what I was getting at. Mortimer and Randolph Duke argued about nature versus nurture. They wondered if it was simple genetics or nurture that allowed a person to succeed. So they did a little experiment to see which one was right. I could see that Vivian was getting more confused by the second, so I thought I should focus on the story a bit. These guys were billionaires, so it was easy for them to do an experiment like this. It would be nearly impossible for a simple guy like me to set something like this in motion. Hypothetically speaking, an ordinary guy like me, given the right circumstances, could set up an experiment of my own. Vivian's patience had apparently run out with her last sip of coffee when she exclaimed, Thomas, what on earth are you talking about? I thought it best not to look into her eyes as I continued. Let's say a normal guy, deeply in love with his wife and excitedly awaiting the arrival of his firstborn, hears a horrible, horrible rumor. One that seems to indicate that the woman he has spent the last 8 years of his life with, worshipping and building his life around her, was actually having an affair with some doctor where she worked. At these words I heard Vivian sigh. Suppose this poor man refused to believe these rumors. He believed so strongly in the strength of his wife's character and her love for him, that he would not have accepted this disgusting insinuation, until the wife of the said doctor showed him transcripts and photographs proving that his wife was not only a duplicitous adulteress, but that the child she was carrying was from her lover, and that since she and her douchebag boyfriend couldn't get married until he finalized his divorce from his current wife, she planned to pass the baby off as her husband's child until she and her boyfriend could be together. The asshole doctor even mentioned with a laugh about getting child support. I looked at a shocked and distraught Vivian, and looking her straight in the eye continued. Of course this is all hypothetical. Such bad people don't exist in the real world. As Vivian began to sob quietly, I continued further. Now imagine this poor guy is looking at the options available to him, and none of them are to his liking, and this dumb asshole just absolutely hates every avenue open to him. Every night he comes home to his seemingly loving wife and watches her belly grow, and as her belly grows his love for her dies. Day by day, inch by inch, he feels his heart grow cold. I looked at Vivian to see what she thought of my story, but she continued to cry quietly, putting her elbows on the table and wrapping her arms around her head. But then, in the midst of his agony, a beautiful Christmas movie gives him an idea. Suddenly his miasma of sadness is pierced by a sense of purpose. And from that day forward he moves toward his goal with an assertiveness that surprises even himself. He may not be as smart as a hospital CEO, although between you and me, Vivian, he did deny himself everything and paid for that cheater's grad school tuition or an ER doctor, but he was still pretty smart. Assuming, hypothetically speaking of course, that he befriended all the nurses and staff who would deliver babies, work in the hospital nursery, and even the newborn care team. He might even be with them at the hospital Christmas parties, accompanying his wife. He might see them many times as part of the childbirth classes. He may have even met some of them for coffee as a nervous dad-to-be in need of support. Well, Vivian, I don't need to tell a smart person like you that a man like that, with the help of the doctor's vindictive wife, might get a chance to do something to finally prove the great Mortimer and Randolph Duke hypothesis. I think at this point, Vivian began to realize where this story was going. I mentioned earlier that she was smart. And suddenly her sobbing slowed and stopped. Suppose this great visionary had somehow managed to hide from his wife that she was literally ripping his heart out of his chest every day, desecrating every memory the couple had, desperately hoping for his support, planning to gut him personally and financially to the point where only she and her asshole lover could agree to be together. Once again, Vivian, this is a completely fictional story. Monsters like this were invented to scare small children. I'm sure none of us could think of someone so heartless, so wicked, that they would do this to someone they supposedly loved. Vivian intervened with sadness in her voice. I thought I was in love. I had completely dissolved into him and I didn't. I stopped her again with a quick shake of my head. Hush, Vivian, you're spoiling the story and I'm just getting to the good part. Well, our hero, driven by his single scientific purpose, had everything was now in place. He just needed to get things started. Luckily for him, his wife no longer cared about him at all. Otherwise, she would have seen the darkness that enveloped him from time to time and plunged him into a deep depression. And only his sense of scientific duty kept him afloat. Vivian now looked at me with an expression akin to horror as I outlined my story. Her hands no longer trembled with nervousness, and the tears dried on her cheeks as she waited with painful dread for me to continue. Our hero was under great pressure, for now everything had to happen quickly. Finally, in the hospital on Happy Day, the husband patiently awaits the birth of his non-son. He made sure to find out the sex of the baby, even though his wife preferred the sex of the baby to be a surprise. He had experienced enough surprises in his life. As a woman who has worked in hospitals most of her life, Vivian, you probably know that at that time security wasn't on the same level as it is now. And our hero was almost surprised at how easy it was to get it all done. By throwing a small party with humorous gifts and cupcakes for those involved in the birth of the baby, our hero was able to distract everyone long enough to allow his sidekick to get to work. Theoretically, his sidekick could have been the doctor's wife, who felt that her inability to have children may have caused her scumbag husband to have a child with the cheating woman he was working with. Vivian visibly cringed at my description as I continued. Imagine the level of excitement our hero Vivian must have been feeling. He was about to complete Mortimer and Randolph's experiment on a much more basic level, replacing the newborn child of two very well-educated professionals with the child of a 16-year-old heroin addict and her schizo friend, an equally addicted addict. He was finally going to. It was the rumble of a chair that let me know Vivian had fainted, and while I may not have rushed immediately to her aid, I eventually got her back in her seat with the help of a glass of cold water from the toilet tank. While I wasn't sure if Vivian was completely with me in that moment, her glassy, unfocused stare and the recurring tick on her cheek were my indicators. This story needed to finally be told to the end. As I said, Vivian, our hero had finally reached his ultimate goal. It should have been a moment of great triumph, and for a brief moment it was. But then he made the mistake of looking into the room where he saw his soon-to-be ex-wife recovering from a 12-hour labor. A huge wave of affection and nostalgia swept over him. And just like that, he was done with it? He asked himself this difficult question. The thought of taking away something that was so important to someone he loved so much suddenly became unbearable, and he decided to fix it right then. But and Vivian, you're going to want to hear this part because it's really important to this hypothetical story. Just as he was about to finish his experiment, something happened that allowed him to fulfill his destiny and set in motion events that went on for 18 years until you arrived here today. Just as he was about to walk up to his wife and tell her everything he had done, a doctor in medical uniform entered the room from another door. Vivian looked concerned as I continued. As he watched the doctor walk over to the woman on the bed and kiss her on the lips, the hero became a poor man again. Watching his wife turn to her lover with pride in her eyes as the two of them shared the moment of their child's birth. I looked back at Vivian and saw that her eyes were squeezed shut, as if she was trying to mentally undo the story. At that moment, Vivian, our hero, was reborn. Like a phoenix from the ashes, all the feelings he once harbored for his cheating wife were completely and irrevocably erased in a riot of fire. In that moment, his commitment to the Duke brothers' legacy was solidified, and his path was clear. Vivian looked at me with eyes full of horror as she finally managed to mutter, How could you do something like that to me and my poor baby?" Her look begged me to explain to her, so I did my best. Well, Vivian, when you're dealing with a baby's DNA, you're talking about 100%, 50%, or 0%. I wanted the baby to be 100% our DNA. You wanted it to be 50% our DNA, and it ended up being 0% our DNA. In reality, neither of us got what we wanted. I smiled encouragingly, hoping she would understand my obviously reasonable logic. I could see that Vivian's brain was desperately trying to make its way through the multitude of clutter created by my revelation. As I had noted earlier, aside from turning into a horrible person, she had always been very intelligent. It only took her a few moments to get to the heart of the matter. The only way to know the outcome of your experiment is if you know how both kids turned out. You just found out how Benjamin's. She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, looking at me questioningly. Well, hypothetically speaking, the experiment didn't work quite as our hero expected. It turned out that the son of a 16-year-old heroin addict was already up for adoption at that point. Hypothetically speaking, he had happily grown up in a middle-class family and was currently a sophomore in college where he hoped to become a lawyer. If he goes through with it and becomes a lawyer, he will find himself, in the hero's humble opinion, in a much better position than Benjamin. I don't think Vivian agreed with my view of the situation, and I could see the wheels turning as she tried to figure out a way to get what she wanted. "Do you know what college he's attending?" she asked hopefully. I replied, "I don't know. You can put your DNA on the registry and see if he can find his biological parents if he wants to look, of course. Other than that, you'll never hear from me again. Anyway, it's all hypothetical," I concluded with a smile. "Plus," I added, "you have a son that you and your asshole doctor have been raising for the last 18 years. Let's not forget about Benjamin." Sure, Vivian muttered, slowly heading for the door. Knowing how long her loyalty to me and our marriage had lasted, once she saw what she thought was best, I had a strong feeling that Benjamin would soon be on his own. Walking out the front door, Vivian turned to me. Thomas, for what it's worth, I'm truly sorry. Until you explained to me, I didn't let her finish. Vivian, it's all right. I'd like to think that the last 18 years of fighting between you and Jerry, while raising someone else's problem child, has made us equals. Vivian started to respond to my ingenuous smile with a smile of her own, before she considered what I had said, and her smile turned into a frown. Before she could ask how I knew what was going on in their marriage, I had already turned to the TV and closed the door. Maybe I'd make it to the second half of the game. The end. Subscribe to my channel, thank you.